Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. My name is Alyssa Cohen, and I am the Deputy Director and Senior Vice President of the museum, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to our beautiful theater today for a very, very special talk with a dear friend, Deborah Lipstadt. I want to first make sure everybody turns off their cell phones, please. Thank you. And I want to give a special thanks to our board member, Patty Kenner, for making this afternoon's talk with Deborah possible, and for everything that she does for this museum tirelessly. So thank you, Patty, wherever you are at the moment. Deborah Lipstadt really defies description. She's just an incredible Holocaust historian, one of the greats of our time. She remembers as a little girl watching the Eichmann trial in her parents' living room. Who would have thought that on April 11th, 2011, on the 50th anniversary of the Eichmann trial, Dr. Lipstadt would be addressing the State Department on the impact of the trial. That's a little girl's dream come true. Lipstadt's book, The Eichmann Trial, was called by Publishers Weekly a penetrating and authoritative dissection of a landmark case and its after effects. The Times noted that it was rendered with devastating fairness. Her book, History on Trial, My Day in Court with a Holocaust Denier, published years later, is the story of her libel trial in London against David Irving, who sued her for calling him a Holocaust denier and right-wing extremist. The book won the 2006 National Jewish Book Award and was first up for the Courtroom Award. The Daily Telegraph in London's review, there were reviews everywhere, but this one I think really says something. It has done for the new century what the Nuremberg tribunals or the Eichmann trial did for earlier generations. So there you have it, two seminal books by this great historian, two seminal trials of the 20th century, and she is here today to talk about both. I do want to tell you something about her recent work at where she is the Dorot Professor of Modern Jewish History and Holocaust Studies at Emory. But this is what I think is really fascinating. Professor Lipstadt directs the website that she created known as Holocaust Denial on Trial, which, in addition to cataloging legal and evidentiary materials from David Irving trial, contains answers to frequent claims made by deniers. And Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism. And this site is translated into Arabic, Farsi, Russian, and Turkish, and is frequently accessed in cities throughout Iran. Its seventh most visited country is Saudi Arabia. So let's welcome this activist, this great person to our stage right now. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here. I've spoken from the stage before, but something hit me when Alyssa was introducing me and saying that I spoke at the State Department on the 50th anniversary of the trial in conjunction with the publication of my book on the Eichmann trial. April 11th, 2000 was also the day on which the verdict was handed down in my trial. God works in mysterious ways, you know? So that day is an infamous day in many ways. Or maybe infamous might be the wrong word, but it certainly is a day with meaning. The Eichmann trial. Many of you have seen the exhibit. Some of you will see the exhibit subsequent to this event. I haven't seen it yet, but I've seen other exhibits, many exhibits on the Eichmann trial. But who was Adolf Eichmann, and what impact did his trial have on the world at large and on the Jewish community and on Israel and Jews in the United States? Adolf Eichmann was not the architect of the final solution. He didn't plan it, he didn't devise it, he didn't create it. Often we have that impression. In fact, when David Ben-Gurion walked into the Knesset to announce that Eichmann had been captured, he essentially described him as that. He said it was a two-sentence announcement. I have to inform the Knesset that a short time ago, one of the great Nazi war criminals, Adolf Eichmann, the man responsible together with Nazi leaders for what they called the final solution, which is the annihilation of 6 million European Jews, was discovered by Israeli security forces. Adolf Eichmann is already under arrest in Israel and will be placed on trial shortly under the terms of the law for the trial of Nazis and their collaborators. He made this announcement in the Knesset. If you've been to Israel, been to Jerusalem, it's not the Knesset building of today, but the building, which I think now is the Office of Tourism right on King George Street, not far from the intersection with Ben Yehuda Street, just a little geography. But who was he? Well, unlike Ben-Gurion's announcement and the way it was perceived, he wasn't, as I said, it wasn't his idea. He wasn't even the CEO, the chief executive officer of the final solution, but he was one of its primary COOs, chief operating officers. He was responsible for the deportation of Jews from Germany. He was responsible for the deportation of Jews from much of Western Europe. He really, France, the Netherlands, Belgium. He was responsible for the destruction of the Saloniki Jewish community, the very old and very established Greek Jewish community. And in the final, literally months of the war, he oversaw the destruction of Hungarian Jewry. The Hungarians, as you know, this bears really emphasizing, the Hungarians, as many of you know, were allies of the Germans, worked hand in hand with the Germans, but the one thing they refused to do was to allow the deportation of the Jews. Jews were in labor camps, Jews were at certain places in ghettos, in terrible conditions, but they weren't being deported to the death camps. Consequently, in the late winter, early spring of March 44, you still had 800,000 Jews in Hungary. And Hungary, of course, was very broad. The borders in that area change quite frequently, or used to change quite frequently. But that's one of you, many of you know Elie Wiesel, of Blessed Memory's book, Night, how he describes how someone comes back from a killing and begins to describe what happens, and nobody in his town will believe them. He was in the Carpathian Mountains, which of course was east. It wasn't Budapest, but a part of Hungary. It's so late in the war. That's why someone is coming back to tell them what's going on. In March of 44, the Germans, afraid that the Hungarians were going to switch sides, and join the Allies, which the Romanians had done shortly before, because the Russians were coming so far west, and it was clear that Germany had lost the war. It was unclear how long the war would take. It was unclear what Germany would constitute when the war was over, but that the Allies were moving forward, the Soviets were moving forward was clear. So in mid-March 1944, the Russians essentially, the Germans stage a coup or take over Hungary's government. And Admiral Horthy, who was the head of the Hungarian government, agrees to stay on sort of as a puppet of the Germans. And within a week or so after this takeover, Eichmann comes to Budapest with somewhere between 200 and 300 SS men to conduct the deportations. And within the space, he arrives in Budapest about the third week in March. He has a meeting with the leaders of the Jewish community at the end of March. People who come in, you can come take seats. Don't stand there in the back. It makes me more distracting to have you standing in the back than come on in. Come on down, as Bob Barker would say. And the deportations from Hungary begin in May, second week in May, 1944, and go through July 44. In the space of those approximately 12 weeks, it's actually less than 12 weeks, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews are murdered at Auschwitz. If you've been to Birkenau, I assume many people have been to Birkenau, you know that the train tracks go right into the camp, to the very end of the camp where the gas chambers are. That spur, the original unloading place in Auschwitz, is about a quarter of a mile, even less than that, outside the camp. But because the Hungarian deportations had to be undertaken fast, efficiently, because the war was closing in, it was important to kill as many Jews as you can, as fast as you can, they built that spur all the way into the camp. So in the space of, as I say, it's less than 12 weeks, actually it's about 10 weeks, over 400,000 Jews are killed. It's really that murder that gives Auschwitz its dubious, distinguished title as the world's greatest killing fields. The murders are at such a pace that Jews are held, Hungarian Jews are held in the woods right next to the gas chambers because they can't process them, kill them fast enough. That's all overseen by Adolf Eichmann. And in fact, when Himmler orders that the deportations end, because Himmler at that point is trying to negotiate with the West, thinking that maybe some sort of new Germany will emerge and he will be the leader of it, and he orders the end of the deportation, Eichmann manages to sneak out another train from Hungary, one more trainload of Jews from Hungary to Auschwitz. There was a debate when Eichmann came to Hungary to oversee this deportation. And by the way, when I say he came with 200 men, he didn't just do this with 200 men. He did this with the overwhelming cooperation of the Hungarian military, the Hungarian police, Hungarian civilians, the train op. This was not something that could be done with 200 people or even 300 people. So he had great support from the Hungarians. And in fact, those of you who've been to Budapest have seen the amazingly effective memorial on the banks of the river of the shoes, the bronze shoes, the Jews who were tied together and pushed into the river. That was done by Hungarians, that murder of those Jews, not by Germans. And so the killings go on in Hungary after the Germans ended. But that's all done by Eichmann. He was a master at organization. I know there's some people here whose roots are from Vienna. It's in Austria, really, that he first proves his mettle, so to speak, to the German government in terms of what he can organize. The Anschluss, which if you're an Austrian, you will describe as the German invasion of Austria. If you're a Austrian Jew, you will say such an invasion. They were welcomed with open arms and with flowers and with cheers. And Eichmann is sent by the SS to Vienna to rid Austria, mainly most of the Austrian Jews lived in Vienna, the vast majority, as quickly as possible. But to rid them, to get them out of Austria and enrich the SS at the same time. What we often forget is that the Holocaust was also a great business, money-making operation, particularly for the SS. The SS was trying to, if you've read Primo Levi's description or many other descriptions of Auschwitz, you had all these sub-camps where they were trying to create rubber and they were trying to do all sorts of things. Siemens was there, other companies were there, Krupp was there, because they wanted to make money from this. And the work, and most of the work was just stupid work and it never produced anything, but this was part of the operation. So Eichmann is sent to Vienna to rid the country of Jews. Remember, this is before they have decided on the murder of the Jews. This is 38. but to make sure that they leave behind their possessions. And you read descriptions. This goes on. He takes over the Rothschild Palais, the Rothschild home in the center of Vienna, and sets up what is essentially, Austrian Jews and Viennese Jews describe it as an assembly line. You entered the large room in which this all took place as a person with bank accounts, maybe with some property, maybe with commercial interests, with possessions. And you emerged with an exit card, permission to leave, and nothing else. So they were stripped of all their goods. And this is what Eichmann does. And in fact, a delegation of German Jews is sent from Berlin to witness this and to organize this in Berlin. Of course, it never happens that way. So he is a great organizer of these operations, of getting Jews, stripping Jews, taking them, moving them out. And he does it with a relatively small staff, mainly of Austrian Nazis, and is very successful at it. So the war is coming to an end. He wants to fight on, but he knows he's got to get out, that his name is on a list. One of his assistants, already when the Allies have begun to capture Germans and are taking information, one of his assistants gives his name. He knows his name has been given. In fact, it's not a name that everybody knew at that point, but he knows he's in trouble. So first he hides out on a ranch, I think it was a lumber ranch, lumber facility and ranch in northern Germany, which is hiding a lot of potential Nazi war criminals. And then once he knows his name, he's on the Allies' radar screen, he moves southward with the help of the Vatican. We don't know precisely who in the Vatican is assisting it, but he has a Vatican pass. And then with that, he gets a Red Cross pass, and he boards a ship and goes to Argentina. Argentina had a large German expat community, Germans who had been there during the 30s into the 40s, during the war, etc., and quite a few potential Nazi war criminals. Quite a few, we're talking in the 20s, 30s, something like that. But there are thousands of Germans who, of course, are supporters of the Third Reich. He works there at the Mercedes-Benz plant, and probably the plant is run by a German expat who knew exactly who he was hiring and exactly who was working for him. First he works on a ranch, then he's on a ranch, and he loved that period. He wrote about it quite with a great deal of nostalgia. But then he works at the Mercedes-Benz plant. The Argentinians knew he was there. The Argentinian police knew he was there. It was not like, if you read Isser Harel's House on Garibaldi Street, it makes it sound like nobody knew he was there. That's really a dramatization of it. If you go into the Argentinian files, they know he was there. The Germans knew he was there. His wife, Vera, first the family announces that he has died, and then suddenly, overnight, she disappears from her town in Germany with her three boys at that point, or 2 boys at that point, and they say she's going to marry someone in Argentina. She's really going to meet her husband, who's now working under the name Ricardo Clement. But the boys kept the name Eichmann. And in fact, I've seen this in the German Foreign Office, the registry in the German embassy in Argentina, where she brings them to renew their passports under the name Eichmann. So clearly it was known that he was there. Somehow, and some of this information has been divulged and released, some not in all of it, this information gets back to Germany to Fritz Bauer. Some of you may have seen there were 2 films on Fritz Bauer in the past year. Fritz Bauer is a German Jew who is in Dachau in the 30s as a socialist. He's put in he's a socialist, a member of the Socialist Party. He's released and he leaves. He goes to Sweden, where another German is there, Willy Brandt. And Willy Brandt is amongst those, and Bauer feels it strongly as well, feels that he's a lawyer, he's trained as a lawyer, and he was a prosecutor, that after the war he has to come back to Germany to oversee the punishment of these people who did this thing, and he does that. He comes back, and he gets distinct information, explicit information, saying Eichmann is in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, under the name Ricardo Clemens. And he gives at that point, Israel did not have diplomatic relations with Germany. That comes shortly before Eichmann is captured. And I'm sorry, it's a little later, but they're barely interacting. But the Jewish Agency does have a representative in Germany. There's still people in DP camps, people have been, and Jewish interests in Germany, et cetera. He gives that information to Israel's highest ranking representative in Germany, who passes it on to Israel. Israel makes a calculation that they are at that point facing external enemies on their border. Israel at that point, any of you who were in Israel in the 50s or know of Israel in the 50s, it was barely a third world country. If you talk to people who were alive in Israel in the 50s, they will tell you about being hungry. Now, I've never heard of anybody in Israel in the past 50 years who's been hungry in Israel. And I don't just mean tourists, there's an abundance. But in the 50s, there was a matun, a real recession, a real shortage of goods and shortage of food. So at that point, Israel has very limited resources and makes a calculation that we have enemies on our borders with whom we have to deal with, and we have enemies who did harm to the Jewish people in years past. It's more important to devote our resources to those on our border than to righting wrongs of the past. Bauer is distressed by this. He, under the guise of an official legal visit to the Attorney General of Israel, the Minister of Justice, he comes to Israel, and he essentially says something to the effect, or is reported to have said, a flat-footed German policeman could have found this guy faster than you are finding him. And he gives Harel specific information confirming without doubt that this man, Ricardo Clemens, is Adolf Eichmann. And Harel brings it to David Ben-Gurion. And David Ben-Gurion at that point could have done one of two things. He could have said, send some of your, Shin Bet or Mossad guys, send some of your biryonim, as you'd say in Hebrew, your strong, muscular guys down to Argentina, and let him be found one morning in a ditch. You don't have to plant Israeli flags on him, but, as we say in Hebrew, hamevin yavin, that other Nazi war criminals will understand what happened to him, and even if we don't capture them, they won't sleep so soundly in their beds. But Ben-Gurion decides something else. He says, go down there, find him, capture him, and bring him back, and we will put him on trial, which I think is one of the amazing decisions by the Israeli government, by the the then leadership of Israel in terms of his fate. You know the story of the capture. You can see it now in the exhibit. He's captured. They hold him for a week, and then it's the anniversary of Argentina, the Independence Day of Argentina, and a delegation of Israeli officials is being flown on an El Al plane to Argentina. It's led by the then Minister of Tourism, I think he's of Tourism at that point, a man named Abba Eban. And they bring him to, the plane lands in Argentina, and it's told, stay, you'll take some people back the next day. And the pilot is told who's taking back. They know, the crew knows something is weird because the chief mechanic for El Al is on the plane because they didn't want, if anything happened to the plane, they didn't want to have to depend on Argentinian mechanics. And the chief, and Harel is on the plane, et cetera, et cetera. And then they bring Eichmann onto the plane. The crew is told who he is. They're survivors of the Holocaust amongst the crew. And he is on the plane. He's blindfolded. They give him cigarettes. He's drugged. One of the crew members says, what he did to my parents, and he's not flying in first class. But of course, they brought him to Israel. But once he gets to Israel, very little planning had been done what should happen next. He gets to Israel, he's taken to the prison in Akko. Many of you visited it, where he's held. And Harel goes to meet with Ben-Gurion, and decisions have to be made now. Who will try him? Where will he be tried? And under what charges will he be tried? Well, under what charges? Israel already had a law that had been passed in the early 1950s, and that's the law that Ben-Gurion mentions when he announces the capture in the Knesset, a law against Nazis and their collaborators. And that law had been passed by the Knesset for two reasons. A, to bring Israel into sync with other European countries which had passed laws against Nazi war criminals. Nobody in the Knesset expected any Nazi war criminal to come to Israel, so that we had to have a law. But the other, it was to bring it in sync that Israel should have the same law towards Nazi war criminals as a number of European countries had. But there was and their collaborators. This was a time when people would get on the bus in Holon or in Ra'anana or wherever, and would be standing next to someone and say, "That was the capo in my barracks. That guy was on the Jewish police in our ghetto. He's the one who oversaw the deportation when my parents were deported." And they needed some mechanism to deal with this. So this law also took care of that. And there were trials of Jews who were considered, and I put this in big quotation marks, collaborators. And I don't think they were collaborators as we often think of collaborators, but in that sense. So there was a law existing in Israel under which Eichmann would be tried. But they needed a place to try him. Ben-Gurion was insistent and that it should be in Jerusalem, and nobody really debated that, since even then they recognized that Jerusalem was the capital of Israel. They didn't need anyone to tell them that in 2017. But they didn't have a courtroom in which to try them. At that time, the courts in Jerusalem met in the Russian compound. The Russian compound, which now houses the Iriyah, the municipality of Jerusalem. But if any of you visited it before the 80s, I would say, when I visited in the 60s, it was dark little courtrooms, et cetera, et cetera. It's where the Kastner trial took place. But they knew that these rooms would not be sufficient for all the press that was already made it clear that they wanted to be at the trial. There were more reporters at the trial than there had been at Nuremberg. So they needed to find a place to hold the trial. So Ben-Gurion assigned one of his main aides, his sort of fixer, the guy who fixed things and made things happen, et cetera, to find a place in Jerusalem which was appropriate for holding a trial of this proportions. So this gentleman, whose name happened to be Teddy Kollek, a lot of characters moved through this story, found Beit Ha'am. Some of you may know Beit Ha'am. It was a sort of community theater, a relatively, certainly for that period, a very nice building. It's on the upper part of Ben Yehuda as you go towards Machane Yehuda, towards the market. And it was just being finished, and he was assured by the builders that it would indeed be finished in time for the trial. And miracle of miracles, it was finished in time for the trial. And the trial would take place in the theater. And in fact, shortly before the trial began, the judges, led by Judge Landau, who was the main judge to hear, it was a tribunal of 3 judges. Israel doesn't have jury trials. And they came to see the place where the trial would be held, and there was a red carpet, like you have a standard red carpet that you would have in many theaters, and he asked that be removed because he wanted to take away any sense that this was theater. Then Israel began to get requests for televising the trial. And they got requests from all the major news outlets, NBC, CBS, et cetera. And they picked, at that time, a relatively unknown, very small television operation called Capital Cities, which today is hardly small. And they set up the televising system. And, of course, shared the tapes. The tapes were shared freely with all the major news outlets here in this country, in England, and in Germany. So that some of you may remember, as I do, that on the evening news in certain markets, New York, Chicago, I believe in Florida, and Miami as well, but in major markets where you had a large Jewish population, after the nightly news, which at that point was 15 minutes, they would broadcast 10 to 15 minutes on what had happened on the trial. And it was usually a day, the trial would be finished, they'd take the reels, they'd be driven right to Lud, what was then called Lud Airport, Ben Gurion Airport. They'd be flown to London, where then copies would be sent to, some would be left in London, copies would be made, sent to Germany, and then brought to the United States. So people saw 24 hours afterwards, they saw what was being televised. It's the first trial ever to be televised, to be filmed live as it's happening. It's also one of the early trials, though Nuremberg is the first trial in this regard, for there to be a simultaneous translation. There's simultaneous translation into, well, it depends what language is being given. If it's in Hebrew, it's translated into, I think, French, English, and German. Hannah Arendt mentions, and other people confirm this, that the French translations were quite good, the English translations were quite good, the German translations were terrible, and she marveled at the fact Beit Am is on the edge of Rehavia. If you knew Rehavia in the 50s and the 60s, it was one yeki after another, because when they moved to Jerusalem, that's where most of them moved to, and she marveled at the fact that with so many German Jews sitting there, that they couldn't find good German translations. There was quite a few representatives of the Yiddish press, including Elie Wiesel, who was there as a reporter covering it for the Yiddish press, but there were many Argentinian press, Yiddish press, etc. And they complained to the Israeli press office because the press office distributed summations of the trial, of what went on each day, but they didn't compile one in Yiddish. And when the Yiddish journalists complained to the Israeli press office, remember this is 61, they were told, learn Hebrew. And eventually they do prepare summaries, which are available in the archives of what's going on. So they have a place, they have judges. There's also a debate over who should be the judges in this trial, and eventually they choose Landau to be the head judge, even though the head judge should have been the president of the Jerusalem District Court, the way the court system is set up. That's a Judge Halevi. But Halevi had been the judge in the Kastner trial. Now, Kastner wasn't on trial. Kastner, remember, was suing the people who called him a Nazi collaborator for having worked with the Hungarians. And Halevi, in his judgment on that trial, had said of Kastner, Machar et nafsho la Satan, he sold his soul to the devil. And who was the devil? Eichmann, because that's whom he negotiated with. So you couldn't very well have a chief judge who had already called your defendant Satan but he was a member of the tribunal. And many legal experts could never quite figure out why Eichmann's lawyer never challenged that, but he didn't. Now, speaking of lawyers, Ben Gurion knew that if this wasn't going to be considered a show trial, remember this is post-Stalin, everybody knows the term show trials. We know if you're in the West, you've read of the Stalinist show trials. If this was not going to be considered a show trial, Eichmann had to have good representation. So Israel passes a special regulation saying that someone who is not a member of the Israeli bar can argue in this case, and it's a capital case. Under this law, this is one of the only laws, I think it is the only law in Israel which has capital punishment as a crime. That he could have a German lawyer. The only stipulation they made was that the lawyer could not have been a member of the Nazi Party, because that would have been too galling. But they do find someone who has represented a number of the defendants at Nuremberg, and he comes to serve as Eichmann's lawyer, and he's paid by Israel to defend him. So then it's time for the prosecutor. And at this point, Israel had a new attorney general. There had been a lot of political upheavals in Israel at the time, and it had a relatively new attorney general, a man who was known as a commercial lawyer in Tel Aviv, but was not a litigator and certainly was not a criminal litigator. And his name was Gideon Hausner. And everybody thought Hausner would appoint someone in his office to handle the trial, but Hausner wanted to do it himself. So he began to prepare for this trial. He prepared by reading the Nuremberg documents. Those were his sources for the documents. But then he made a decision, really pushed by a woman who was a survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, a survivor of the Ringelblum group, and who was now working at Yad Vashem, to include testimony from survivors. And he makes a critical decision to bring survivors as witnesses. And there are, I think, 102, 103 witnesses who testify, 95 of whom are survivors. And Hausner makes a decision that and he's really going to try Eichmann as the architect of the final solution, even though he was not the architect. It was unclear how much Hausner fully realized that at this point. But he was going to tell the story of the Shoah from the beginning to its final moments, including aspects of it with which Eichmann had no connection. And many people who have some criticism of the trial have criticism of that aspect, and it's not an illegitimate criticism, that there were stories told about shootings on the Eastern Front and other things with which Eichmann had no direct connection. There was much that was told with which he had a direct connection: the Hungarian deportations, the Greek deportations, French, German, etc., but aspects that were not told. But he makes a decision to amass these group of survivors to tell their story, and that's probably the critical decision that he makes. Because even though in the final decision of the judges, because the judges say we have heard many, many moving stories, but we are going to judge him based on the documents, not on people's personal recollections. And based on the documents, we find him guilty. And they say, and it is the stories are moving, but it is the documents which will have their lasting impact. And on that, the judges were really wrong, because it's the stories that the survivors tell. It's not the first time survivors speak. Many people will say, and when I first began to write my book on the Eichmann trial, many people said to me, including Israelis, contemporaries of mine, people younger than me, but who were in grade school and high school at that time, said, oh, that trial really changed things in Israel. Before that, we never spoke of the Shoah, and after that, we spoke of the Shoah. But that's not really true. That's impressionistic. In fact, in 1956, on Yom HaShoah, 40,000 people came to the Holocaust Remembrance Day ceremonies. That's 1956, 5 years before the trial. If 40,000, now true, most of them were survivors of the Holocaust, but still, if 40,000 people are coming to a commemoration, it doesn't mean that no one is speaking of it. In fact, even earlier than 56, in 52, I mentioned the law that was passed. There's a tremendous debate in the Knesset about that law. There's also a debate about the establishment of Yad Vashem. What should Yad Vashem be? Should it be a research place? Should it be a commemoration place? There's a great deal of discussion and debate about it. So that to say that it's never spoken of, it was spoken of, but never before had the stories been heard or been told in such an intensive fashion that Israelis watched. And you get many, there's a wonderful, I'm sure the bookstore here has it on sale, a book by Chaim Guri. Chaim Guri was a journalist who was covering, he was also a poet, but he was covering the trial for one of the Israeli newspapers. I think it's called Facing the Glass Booth in English. It was originally in Hebrew. And he writes, about how we knew, but we never fully understood. And others write the same thing. They write that it suddenly became clear to them as these survivors are on. At this point, the survivors are 30 years old, 40 years old, maximum 50 years old. I mean, it's 1961. The war ends in 45. So you can do the math in that sense. And many, as I read many of the Israeli commentators and people who were at the trial and who write about its impact afterwards, and what becomes clear to them that these were not people who were flawed in some way and didn't know how to fight back and didn't know how to defend themselves. Remember, this is the time of Israel's founding myth of a Sabra and the new Jew and this Jew, which is all correct, but the new Jew who was unlike the ghetto Jew, as it was often referred to. But many Israelis, in listening to these people, realized that what happened to them was a chronological and geographical, poor chronological and geographical fate. In other words, they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It wasn't that there was something wrong with them in that sense. Sadly, and again, those of you who are from Israel, who lived in Israel, visited during the 60s, even into the 70s, you know the term for survivors. Does anybody know what the term for survivors was in that period? Sabonim, soaps. Those who would have been made into soap. And in fact, I was recently giving a talk about this, and a woman was sitting there, and she said, my son just finished the army, and in his, I don't know if it's across Tzahal, across the IDF, or in his unit or whatever, but when someone is a coward or not playing his full role, or they will often say to him, don't be a sabon. They don't connect it to that. It's just become part of the slang. And I bet, she said, if I asked my son what the meaning of that word, he'd have no idea. But look, it's easy today to be horrified this and be critical. It was a different era and a different image. And the image of the founders of Israel was, this is a new kind of Jew, a Jew who fights back, a Jew who we take our fate into our own hands, and this is not what happened there. And I think that's a very strong part of it. So it had a strong impact, and Israel had a very strong impact in this country as well. Many people will tell you that until 1967, the Holocaust was never spoken of, but that's not really true either. In fact, again, speaking of Elie Wiesel, when Wiesel submits Night for publication, it gets turned down by many, many publishers with one of two reasons. Either they say there is no audience for this, or there have been too many memoirs already on the Holocaust. And if you look at Night, and Muriac, the great French literary figure and Nobel Prize winner, writes the introduction. He's the one who really helps Wiesel get it published in English, in French and then in English. And he writes in his introduction, this memoir, coming as it does after so many others, and goes on to talk about its uniqueness. So it wasn't, again, as if nobody was talking about it. People were talking about it. There were films, Judgment at Nuremberg, Diary of Anne Frank. Diary of Anne Frank is on Broadway in 58, 59. The movie comes out shortly, or it's actually a little earlier, the movie comes out shortly thereafter. It's a stylized, it's a very flawed vision, but again, it's not as if there was no discussion. But the Eichmann trial in many ways is a watershed in changing the level of discussion so that what comes after, the discussion that comes in 67 wouldn't have come without the preparatory groundwork of the trial. The trial from a legal perspective, because I know there are a number of lawyers here also, the trial reinforced the notion that there is a universal jurisdiction over genocide and crimes against humanity. Many people, many countries, were very critical of Israel when Israel kidnapped, that's the right word, kidnapped Eichmann from Argentina and brought him to Israel. They said this is wrong. There was their hearings in the UN at that point, and the Security Council was very critical. And the French ambassador to the UN, who actually had been sympathetic to the Nazis, was decrying what had happened in Germany. Golda Meir comes to the UN to represent Israel because the debate is felt to be so important. And at one point, Henry Cabot Lodge, who was then our ambassador to the UN, was going to vote in favor of censoring Israel. And he gets a call from, the story goes, and we don't have documentation of this, we do have people who tell the story who were around at the time and involved, that the debate is going on in May of 1960, and Richard Nixon calls Henry Cabot Lodge and said, "Are you still interested in being my running mate?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "Then you better not abstain or vote to censure Israel, because that's not where we stand." But eventually, a sort of compromise is worked out at the UN led by the United States, where Israel is censured but not asked to return Eichmann. So some people have put it, Argentina got its apology and Israel got its man, to try him. The trial is set and the trial begins, and if there are any Israelis here who were educated in Israel in the 60s and 70s, I've been told that you were all taught, the opening sentence of Gideon Hausner's opening sentence of his presentation before the judge. He says, today, first he starts by calling them Shoftei Yisrael, judges of Israel, which is a decidedly biblical term, if not from the Torah, from the Tanakh, from the prophets and the writings. So he's immediately looking that back to this history, and he says, I don't stand alone today before you. 6 million voices cry out from the ground, using again language from the story of Cain and Abel. It's poignant with meaning. And then he begins to call the survivors, some of the, not survivors, but the people who, survivors of the Holocaust and some who had escaped before. But I want to go back to one point when I was talking about the criticism of Israel before I talk about the survivor aspect. Many people who were critical of Israel, Israel said, look, Argentina had him all these years and never thought to try him. They had tried to get Mengele. They knew Mengele had been in Argentina and they never thought to try him. And many people were critical and said, Germany, the correct place for trying him is Germany. But what very few people were recognized is the last thing Konrad Adenauer wanted was this trial to be in Germany. First of all, already in 1952, in a speech before the Bundestag, Adenauer had said enough already with the chasing down of war criminals. Germany had a terrible record until this trial. Afterwards, it had some of its more important war criminals trial, particularly the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial. But in Germany, it sort of was, get on with it. And in fact, Adenauer's, the undersecretary of state the head of the federal chancellery, which essentially was Adenauer's chief of staff, was a man named Hans Globke. And Hans Globke had authored the legal commentary on the Nuremberg laws. The Nuremberg laws had been issued in September 1935, but then they needed regulations. When it says Jews should not be citizens, how do we put this into effect? He had written all that legal commentary and application of the Nuremberg laws. And he also had a hand in 1938 rule that Jews must add the names Israel or Sarah to their given names. Some of you who have parents who were survivors may have their passports in which, no matter what their name was, Israel or Sarah is given as their middle name, so they'd be immediately recognizable as Jews. But their law exempted Jews with blatantly Jewish names from this regulation. So maybe if your name was Mendel, you didn't have to add Israel. I don't say this in jest at all. Globke was the person who made this list up of what were recognizable Jewish names. So you sort of imagine this man sitting there deciding what name is recognizably Jewish and what not. And then, of course, he becomes chief of staff of Adenauer's office. But we shouldn't just focus on him. In the 1950s, virtually all the leading positions in the Foreign Office were held by people who had served in the Third Reich. why did Fritz Bauer not pass the information on to the German embassy in Argentina that Eichmann was there? Because the same people who were staffing the German embassy in the late 50s were the same people who had staffed it in the 40s. I think half of them had been on the. So Germany was riddled with former Nazis. The last thing Adenauer wanted was Eichmann in the witness box saying, "You're trying me? Hans Klopke's over there. This one's over there. That one's over there." Adenauer didn't want that. So he was very appreciative of Ben-Gurion saying, not that Ben-Gurion was going to turn him over to the Germans in any way. Ben-Gurion's point was this was a crime against the Jewish people. No other country represented the Jewish people. No other country had as many survivors in it who had been directly harmed by this man. His trial was going to be here. But all those people who said, including some leading American Jews, felt it should be in Germany, that Germany had no interest. And in fact, when Hausner sent Ben-Gurion his opening speech just for him to look at, Ben-Gurion only read the first part, he asked Hausner to make a few changes. And one of the changes he asked, they said, every time you refer to Germany, please refer to Nazi Germany. So it's different from this Germany. And that's quite striking. So going back now to the survivors, these over 100 survivors testify. As I said, the story had been told before. Survivors had spoken before. But I don't think it was ever heard in the way it was heard at the trial. The hearing was different, not the telling. And just to tell you some of the stories that some of these survivors told, there was one then magistrate who began to tell his story. His name was Beisky, who goes on eventually to be a Supreme Court judge. And he begins to tell his story. You can read his testimony. He's testifying in complete sentences, in complete paragraphs. Not as we often talk, we don't finish sentences. When I listen to a tape of a speech, I say, "Oh my God, you never finished a sentence." This guy was testifying in not complete sentences, but complete paragraphs. And in fact, when he goes into the witness box, Moshe Landau says to him, "You may sit." And he says, "No, I prefer to stand." He's a man of the court. He's a magistrate. Court deserves a certain respect, a certain formality, and he was going to give it that formality. And he begins to tell his story, and he tells the story of, at one point, he is in a camp, and there are about 400 Jews, and they're surrounded by Nazi guards. And Hausner interrupts him and says, "Well, why didn't you resist? Why didn't you fight back? There were so many Jews and so few others." And suddenly, this man of complete sentences, complete paragraphs, changes, and he begins to talk, and he says a few words, and he turns to Moshe Landau and says, "May I sit?" And he sits down, and then he goes on to say, this was and Hausner asked him, "Why did you board the train, the deportation train?" And Beisky says, "This was 1943. After so many years, we did not have the strength to resist anymore. We wanted to die more quickly. The moment we saw the train moving going towards Belzec, he escapes. But he goes on, he begins to talk more about, and then he begins to describe another scene before they board the train of 15,000 people. He said 15,000 people stood there, and this was when they were forced to watch a child be lifted up to a chair and a rope put around his neck, and the child begged for mercy. This is Beisky saying, an order was given to hang him a second time. When the first time they tried to hang the child was too light, so they weighted him down. And as Beisky is telling the story, Hausner interrupts and again says, 15,000 people there, why didn't you revolt? And it's at that point that Beisky asks to sit down. And then he goes on, this was already in the third year of the war. Nonetheless, there was still hope. Here were people working on forced labor. They apparently needed this way. Possibly, maybe, he has to sit down, And then he goes on to say, I cannot describe this terror-inspiring fear. Near us was a Polish camp. There were 1,000 Poles. 100 meters behind the camp, they had a place to go to, their homes. I don't recall one instance of escape on the part of the Poles, but where could any Jew go? We were wearing clothes which were dyed yellow with yellow stripes. In the center of our hair, they made a kind of swath in a stripe 4 centimeters in width. And at that moment, let us suppose that 15,000 people within the camp even succeeded without armed strength to go beyond the boundaries of the camp. Where could they go? What could they do? And it's a very, very powerful moment. There's another very powerful moment which was described in the trial by a Professor George Villers, French from Paris, and he describes the Roundup of July 42. Many of you are familiar with that. There have been certain films about it, when the children are rounded up and separated from the parents. And he describes the scene near Drancy where the children are being held. They slept over 100 to a room on straw mattresses on the ground, mattresses which were filthy, disgusting, and full of vermin, with no adult nearby. It was not uncommon for them to awake during the night screaming for their parents. Some were too young to know their own names. So their state of cleanliness was frightful. Waves of diarrhea. And then he tells, Villers tells of a particular visit he makes to the camp with René Blum, the brother of the French premier, Leon Blum, to see the children. He said, we spoke with one boy who was remarkably handsome, with a face which was very intelligent. He wore clothes which once must have been of very good quality, rather stylish, but now in a pitiful condition. One foot was bare. When we asked him about his parents, the boy said, my father goes to the office and Mummy plays the piano. When they reassured him he would rejoin his parents, even though both Villers and Blum knew that he was headed for Auschwitz, the boy happily showed us a biscuit he was saving for his mother. Blum, and this is now Villers talking, Blum bent over the little boy who looked very happy, very engaging. Blum took his face in his hands and wanted to stroke his head. And at that moment, the child, who had only a moment ago had been so happy, burst into tears because of that human touch. And you have those kind of descriptions over and over again. The last 2 stories I want to tell you come, because I began with that, from the Hungarian deportations. One is a testimony given by a woman named Margit Reich. She took the stand and she told of the Hungarian Jews' desperate plight. And then she described how her husband, who had been deported, had written her a letter that he threw from the train on which he was deported to Auschwitz. On the outside of the train, he wrote, "Blessed is the hand that posts this letter." And someone had actually posted it. And in it, he wrote, "My dear," and just 17 years later, it was not that long, "My dear wife and children, we are entering upon a very long journey. I shall somehow bear my fate, whatever it may be. I do not want to make you sad, but I would very much want to live in your midst. May God grant us that we may be allowed to achieve that." He never returned. Now, Margit Reich, was too overcome to read the letter, and she asked then Associate Prosecutor Gabriel Bach, who also goes on to be a very distinguished member of the Israeli High Court, to read it. And I was on a program with Bach not long after my book came out, and he remembered that moment very, very powerfully. The other story, also from the Hungarian jury, was a man named Martin Foldy. And he described to the court how he arrived at Birkenau, and he was separated. He went to the side of people who would live, and his wife and children were sent to the other side. And he said they had been sent to the left, of course, the gas chambers. And he recalled that despite the crush of people, I could identify them. And so Bach asked him, "How could you identify them?" And he said, just a few days earlier, we had bought my little girl, who was about 4 years old, a red coat. The red spot, this is Foldy, the red spot was a sign that my wife was near there. The red spot was getting smaller and smaller. He never saw her again. Of course, the red coat appeared in Schindler's List, which is where Steven Spielberg obviously got the inspiration for it. The last thing, and I know many of you, this could be a speech into itself, and I will only briefly touch on it, of course, is Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt is there covering the trial for the New Yorker magazine. She had originally wanted to cover it for Commentary, but Commentary refused to pay her costs. So she got the New Yorker to cover it. And in many respects, she got things very, very wrong. She got things very wrong in the sense of, just find it here, in the sense of the Judenrate described, the Jewish councils, describing them as collaborating. She got things terribly wrong. She thought Eichmann was a low-level clerk, a sort of jerk, who spoke in highfalutin bureaucratic language, probably all an act to sort of try to present himself as just a do-nothing to the court. She misread him a lot. And she said some very terrible things, and for that, she deserves the criticism she gets. But she also said some very powerful things. And one of the things she said that I found so powerful, two things let me share with you. She writes, she's corresponding with her professor, Carl Jaspers. Carl Jaspers, one of the people who gave her her doctorate at a very young age. And she becomes quite close with him. And she's corresponding, and Jaspers, who was married to a Jewish woman whom he protected from deportation during the war, writes, and he thinks that maybe Eichmann shouldn't have been tried in Israel. This is right before. And this is what she writes to him. We kidnapped a man who was indicted in the first trial in Nuremberg. We abducted him from Germany from Argentina because Argentina had the worst possible record for the extradition of war criminals. We did not take him to Germany, but to our own country. And then she goes on to say, Israel had as much right to sit in judgment on the crimes committed against the people as the Poles had to judge crimes committed in Poland. So it's a very strong identification. And then she says something else, which I think really represents what this trial was about. She writes this, and it's too frequently overlooked. If you have Eichmann in Jerusalem at home, go back and find this paragraph. What was the importance of this trial? For the first time since the year 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, Jews were able to sit in judgment on crimes committed against their own people. For the first time, they did not need to appeal to others for protection and justice, or fall back on the compromised phraseology of the rights of man, rights which, as no one knew better than they, were claimed only by people who were too weak to defend their rights and enforce their own laws. Ben-Gurion could not have said it better. That's what the difference in this trial was. That in this sense, Jews were able to say, here is a man who did us harm, and we will give him what never was given to the Jews he helped destroy, a trial. We don't have to depend on others to try him for us. It was the ultimate statement about the Jewish emergence from powerlessness. And I think it's an exceptionally important statement. She also was very critical of Germany, where she said Nazi criminals flourish in the public realm, where Adenauer had been fantastically lenient towards them. So I think it's a much more nuanced coverage than we often give her credit for, even though parts of it I am very, very critical of what she said. Let me close by looking back on this trial as a watershed moment in the history of the Holocaust, post-war history of the Holocaust, a watershed moment in helping create a field of study. After this trial, there were the number of people who said they wanted to study Holocaust on a serious level skyrockets in Israel, in the United States, and eventually a field of study is born. And most of all, especially to say this in this museum, where the voice of the survivor was heard. Not that they spoke for the first time, but was heard in a way that it hadn't been heard before. And I want to close you with the way I closed my book on the trial. A number of years ago, I was invited to a conference at Yad Vashem. While there, I met a group of young Rwandans who had asked Yad Vashem to train them in how to conduct oral testimony with trauma victims. This was shortly after the genocide in Rwanda. They had turned to Israeli representatives in Rwanda and in Yad Vashem to how do we do oral histories? How do we take testimony from survivors? In fact, Yehuda Bauer told me at the time that there had been an opening dinner for these Rwandans who had come to Yad Vashem, and Yad Vashem had invited a number of French-speaking Holocaust survivors, France, Belgium, et cetera, because other than Rwandese, it's got a very complicated name. The European lingua franca in Rwanda is French because of the Belgians. Yad Vashem, eager to make them comfortable, arranged for them to have dinner on their first night in Jerusalem with French-speaking survivors. And what Bauer told me was that they bonded so strongly with the survivors that the whole program of the conference went to hell because the survivors said, well, we're taking them home for dinner tomorrow night. We're picking them up. They have to meet my children, my grandchildren, etc. By the end of the dinner, the two groups of survivors had bonded so strongly that the elderly survivors took the young Rwandans under their wings, invited to their home, introduced them to their families, and began to build personal relations. One afternoon, I sat with some of the Rwandans outside of Yad Vashem, looking over the Judean hills. They told me of their experiences during the genocide and their meeting with Holocaust survivors. One young man whose entire family had been murdered said to me, I want to tell my story and help my fellow Rwanda survivors tell theirs, just like the Holocaust survivors. I want people to listen to me as they listen to them. Despite, then he went on to say something which there was an inherent contradiction, but I knew exactly what he meant. He said, future generations, those who were not there, must remember. You can't remember if you were not there. But it's just as we try to remember, especially those of us who were not there. And we, he went on to say, we who were there must tell them. That telling of the story and that hearing of the story may be the most enduring legacy of what occurred in Jerusalem in 1961. Thank you very much. Please. If you sit down, we have time for a few questions. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to take some questions. Yes, please.
I have a mic.
I'll repeat the question. Oh, here comes a mic right behind you. Right here.
How would you compare the Eichmann trial that took place in the 1900s to your own trial that took place in
2000?
Exactly.
Very different. First of all, I was the defendant. He was the defendant too, but my trial was the first time ever, the only time, where either a survivor or a historian of the Holocaust was on trial, as opposed to vice versa, like the Zundel trial in Canada, where the denier was on trial. In that sense, I think they're very different. One was a libel trial, one was a trial for crimes against humanity. But where they were the same certainly for me, was the raw anti-Semitism I heard in the room. I heard that from David Irving. David Irving, of course, has never killed anyone, never, did anything that way. But the raw Jew hatred I heard, and that you felt in what Eichmann was saying, though he didn't display it in the courtroom that much, I think are quite similar. Yeah. Yes, please. Yeah.
Being an anti-Semite, the way the Germans fulfilled whatever it is that they wanted to fulfill isn't going away. So to me, the two trials had a lot in common, and the basis was anti-Semitism.
Well, I would say that not that the trial so much had that in common, but that certainly you're absolutely correct that Holocaust denial is not a cognitive error. It's not like the denier didn't get that one memo. Sometimes there'll be a document discovered recently. Some of you may have seen the news story about the document of a Sonderkommando, a Jew who worked in the gas chamber. He kept a diary, and he buried it, and it was found. And now with technology, they were able to figure out what it actually said. And someone called me and said, look, maybe if the deniers saw that, they would understand it really happened. And I said to the person, look, with deniers, it's not that they didn't get the memo or see one document or see one memoir or something like that. It's that they come to this as anti-Semites. The prism through which their view of the Jew is refracted, or anything in which Jews are involved, is an anti-Semitic prism. And it's that, and a prism, as you know, refracts light, bends light. So that their view of the Jew is a bent, warped vision, just like with the racist. You're going to try to tell a Ku Klux Klan person, most people on welfare in this country are white single women and not African American. They won't hear you. They don't want to hear you. They want to think that there were nice people marching in Charlottesville. There weren't nice people marching in Charlottesville. No, and it's serious. Nice people don't march with swastika flags and with Confederate flags. But they don't hear that. The racist, the homophobe, whatever it might be, their view, that's what prejudice is. It warps their view. The denier is not someone who had, didn't take a course on the Holocaust to learn that it happened. The denier is someone who can believe the Holocaust didn't happen, even though for the denier to be right, who would have to be wrong? The survivors, the bystanders, the perpetrators, and thousands of historians, Jews, non-Jews, Americans, Canadians, English, French, Israeli, Germans. I was just in Japan. I met Japanese historians working on the Holocaust. All would have to either be in on the dupe or have been totally mistaken. So how can someone, it doesn't make sense. Of course it doesn't make sense, because anti-Semitism doesn't make sense. Prejudice doesn't make sense. Prejudge, don't confuse me with the facts. I've made up my mind. So you're absolutely correct in that both are motivated by a hatred of Jews, otherwise known as anti-Semitism. Yes, who's got the mics or whatever? Okay. Yes, just go, just find someone.
Yeah. Thank you so much for all of your work on both the Eichmann
This is
trial.
Tony Hausner, nephew?
Distant cousin.
Distant cousin of Gideon Hausner. Yes.
Right. So what do you see as the lessons for today from the Eichmann trial, the Holocaust?
Oh, God. You have an hour? I'm too immersed, Tony, in this to really give you a shorthand lesson, and I don't think any lesson I could give you a regel achat, on 1 foot, literally, would have that much value. But I think the power of memory, the power of remembering, the power of standing up for your rights, and fighting, and not just, of course, fighting anti-Semites. I just finished a book now, a manuscript which will be published in the fall, on contemporary anti-Semitism here and now, of standing up to fight, but also, and I know this is not so popular in certain segments of the Jewish community and some people, but not just fighting for our own rights, and not just fighting for injustices against Jewish people, for 2 reasons. The less important reason, a strategic reason. If I don't stand up for when your rights are assaulted, how can I expect you to stand up when my rights are assaulted? But for a much bigger reason, because that would say, well, I only do it if there's a quid pro quo. Because we're people who are taught tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue. Where, of course, everyone worries about their own first. Am I okay? Is my family okay? Then are others okay? And of course, you have a priority when your own ox is gored, so to speak. But on top of that, we are taught, God hates the liars, the psalmist says. The doers of evil. And the psalmist wasn't just talking about the doers of evil against the Jewish people. And I think sometimes that's hard to do. That's hard to do, especially when you're defending people who have shown very little sympathy towards you. But I'd rather do that and not just make it a quid pro quo. Yes, Stuart. And this, of course, is Stuart Eisenstadt. So
Be our last question.
it's a proper person to end this. Stuart Eisenstadt, who has done more in terms of return of Jewish property and the justice for those who survived and those who did not survive. Stuart.
Thank you, Deborah. First, I'm very proud of the fact that we've known each other for many decades and that you've now joined our Defend Requiem board. I wanted to ask you the following question. Since your book, there has been, perhaps in the last 2 months, an article in the New York Times with recently disclosed Mossad documents indicating that after the Eichmann capture and trial, and because of the other dangers that Israel faced, that Ben-Gurion and others directed Mossad assets elsewhere, rather than, for example, going after Mengele, who might have been captured had there been more attention put. Have you focused at all on that as one of the other ramifications of the Eichmann trial? In other words, they felt that now that they had gotten Eichmann, they could put their emphasis elsewhere.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart, and thank you again for everything you've done for your people. And you're from Atlanta, so, you know, I'm only an adoptee. They still claim you there, even though you moved away a long time ago. It's a good question. Look, I had a sense that was the case because when I began to look at the information the Israelis had about Eichmann, it was clear it was not a priority. And it's very easy, you know, people, what, they knew about Nazi war criminals and it wasn't a priority? Well, it wasn't a priority, as I said earlier, because the dangers they faced around them. And if you think those dangers weren't serious, just think back to June 1967. So did you want Mossad agents in Argentina or Peru, or in Lima or wherever they thought Mengele might be? Or did you want them in Damascus and Cairo? It's very easy from the warmth and comfort of our own settings in this beautiful building to make all sorts of decisions, you know? And sometimes when I'll end with a personal anecdote in the sense that I think you're right. I think there was Ben-Gurion made a strategic decision, and today I hear people very critical. How could they have let Mengele go? How could they have let this person go? It's so easy. You know, I often talk to my students about this because I sit and I teach students, you know, Jewish, non-Jewish, all sorts of colors and backgrounds, et cetera. But I always know when I'm teaching my history of the Holocaust class that when we get to the section on resistance, that's where the students put themselves. If I was there, I would have resisted. They don't say it, but you know that's what they're thinking in that sense. And I sometimes say to them, I want to instill in them a modesty of judgment. It's very easy for historians to judge, or looking back on history for all of us to judge, and especially on something like this. So I say to them, I'm going to ask you a question which I don't want you to answer, even to yourselves. Of course, that's impossible, you know, when you said that. But imagine you were in the ghetto, exactly the same age you are now, 19, 20, 21, and you're with your family, just as your family is now. You have younger brothers and sisters. You have parents who in their mid to late 40s, early 50s were considered old in a ghetto. And you have a chance to escape. But you know if you escape that your parents, your entire family will be on the next deportation train. Do you go or don't you go? Don't answer. What I want people, and maybe this is a note on which to end, you know, as we look back on history, as we look back on, certainly on the Shoah and other histories as well, it's so easy to say, again, from the comfort of this magnificent auditorium, from the comforts of our own home, from the comforts of my classroom at Emory University, what I would have done. I don't know what I would have done. But as we look around us today, if we're not responding to some of the tragedies we see, and whether it's anti-Semitism, whether it's racism, whether it's any other kind of prejudice, it's easy to judge. What is it that the The ethics of Pirkei Avot says, Al tadun et chavercha ad shetagia limkamo. Don't judge your neighbor until you've reached his place. We talked today of a trial, a judgment, a watershed moment in the history of the Jewish people, and I think a moment which can make us very proud of the decisions made by Israel and the way Israel conducted this. Would there have been other trials? Should there have been? I would have hoped so, but we can't judge whether that would have been the case or what was best in terms of what happened. All we can do is look at this one and say it was the right thing to do. Thank you all very much.